bricks. And at one point, I think they made, I have to check our history book, but they were producing a large amount of bricks per year that were used. So those are some of the things that we're doing. Other than that, we look to have on May 17th, Heritage Day, and the Prescott building will be open. And we're going to need some help to spruce it up again, because during the work, they added a new door to the back of the building. So we need to reorganize. So if you're inclined to help at some point on that, please let me know. So that's pretty much the information I have. Does anyone else have any information? Unfortunately, our treasurer is not here, but he would provide an update on what we have. And the town does provide us funds, $750 a year, that we use to purchase some items, historical items. One thing that we recently acquired on eBay was a picture from 1965, which shows Roby's Country Store painted yellow. Well, it looks yellow from the picture, but you see the old. I'll get to the program in 2 seconds. Which you see the train going by, and on the left side of the picture, you see the old transportation bridge, which is now called the Lilac Bridge. And one thing last night at the town meeting, they're deciding to use some impact fees to do engineering study of that bridge in hopes to start, at least get it open so people can walk across the bridge. There'll be a nice connection between the west side of the river and the east side, which will connect the area right next to Roby's store with the area in front of Congregational Church, which is now Veterans Park at Jacob Square. So those are some things that are happening historically in the town of Hooksett. So we thank you for coming. And it looks like we have more members coming, so the speaker will have a full house. And with that, once they get seated, I will introduce Matt Bowes, who will introduce the program for tonight. So thank you very much. There's plenty of seats up here, ladies. Yep. Come on up front here. And make sure before you leave, on your seats there is forms from the New Hampshire Humanities Council, and they would like to do a review and make comments on how great the program will be, or will be. So please make sure you fill that out, and Matt will collect those, and they'll send it up to New Hampshire Humanities Council. So with that, welcome. It's nice to see a great big crowd. And I'm going to introduce Matt Bowes, who is the Assistant Hooksett Public Library Director. He's in charge of programming and many other things. So, Matt?
Thank you all for coming out this evening. Before we get started, I do just want to mention a couple of things. We do have some more great programs coming up at the library. There's a bookmark of all the programs right over here on the table. Please grab one before you leave tonight. Next week, we actually have a screening of Saving Mr. Banks. That's on a Thursday night at 6 o'clock. And there's also a matinee showing at 2 o'clock that day. We also have, the week after that, a talk on paleo dieting. So you can come to the library and learn how to eat like a caveman, how they say. And after that, we have our incredible edible book festival. If you haven't come to that before, you really have to come and enjoy that. It's a chance to see people come out and create something book-related out of food. You don't have to be a good cook or a good baker. I'm proof of that. I participate every year, so please come to that. That's on a Saturday in April on the 12th. Okay? Come on in, folks.
There's a couple seats up front. Don't be afraid. Or be caught in the ties.
And as Jim mentioned, tonight's talk is sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. They sponsor hundreds of these programs across the state throughout the year. And we're so fortunate to have them. Please do fill out their evaluation to help them plan future programming and bring more programs to communities across the state. Okay? And tonight we have with us Michael Tougias. Did I pronounce that? Excellent. He is the award-winning author of 23 and co-author of 23 books. As you can tell from the tables in the back here, he's quite prolific. Tonight he'll be talking about his book, Fatal Forecast, which is a true tale of disaster and survival at sea. And we're so fortunate to have you with us, Michael, and we just want to thank you for sharing your time and your book with us tonight. Okay.
Thank you. The program you're going to see, pretend you're watching a movie because the visuals will take you through this story. And one of the survivors in particular, I think, is probably one of the greatest survival stories in American history. You see what he had to do to keep going. So during the program, sometimes I'll weave in some of the decisions he made to overcome adversity, because every now and then we could use those same mindsets to get through tough patches. And before I get started, I do a newsletter every 6 months, so if you're interested, please print your email. And in the next newsletter, I've got good news. One of the survival books is being made into a major motion picture by Disney. And they should start filming this summer, so that was a lucky break after 30 years of schlepping books out to Hollywood and never hearing anything. And this week, a brand new book came out that I did with a co-author. Does anybody remember when Hurricane Superstorm Sandy came up the coast? There was one vessel hit. It was the tall ship Bounty.
Yes.
And our book just came out this week, and it chronicles what happened, why they were out there, and how this miracle rescue took place. 14 out of the 16 sailors were saved. And another one, people are always giving me suggestions, and somebody said, well, you need to do a love story next. And I said, I have done one. It's embedded within a novel about King Philip's Indian War. It's titled Until I Have No Country. So within this novel, all the events are true about the war, but within the novel, it's a love story between two Native Americans. Because I wanted to give the Native perspective of what it was like to go through America's first war. And then finally everybody goes, okay, so you write about wars and disasters, what a fun guy. I said, well, I have done a book called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. Now this was about a personal disaster, but a fun book. When I was 22 years old, I bought a cabin in northern Vermont and thought I'd live up there like a mountain man, and failed miserably. And so years later, I looked back at the journal I kept and turned that into a book. And what inspired me was reading Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods. It was just a fun book that you actually learned from, and I said, that'll be my model. So There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse was inspired by that particular book. And when I go into schools, the kids always say, what's the best way to be a writer? And I say, read. The more you read, just like Bill Bryson inspired me, the more you read, you get inspired. So with that, I'm going to ask Matt if he could turn the lights down. And then at the end of the program, I'll take any questions or comments you might have. And if you can't see the slides and feel like moving closer, please do. So, Fatal Forecast. By the way, the cover was designed by the survivors. That's pretty realistic where we're going with this story. The location is George's Bank, and when I did the research, I had no idea where George's Bank was, but to get out to the center of it, it's about a 200 miles steam. And one of the reasons that this event occurred in November of 1980, that these relatively small boats, they were 50 feet at the time, which sounds small by today's standards, but back then those were considered a good-sized boat for George's Bank, is they were going way out there to get lobster. And there were 2 vessels involved in this fatal forecast storm, and I'll explain where the title comes from in a minute. One was the Sea Fever, and this was a wooden boat, very well constructed, built in Nova Scotia. And it actually has quite an interesting background. When I was doing the research, I was surprised to read that the owner of the boat was Bob Brown. And I said, I know that name from The Perfect Storm. Well, the same owner who owned the Andrea Gale owned the Sea Fever. And I thought, what a coincidence, because he only owned a handful of boats, 3 or 4 boats. So Bob Brown plays a role in this Fatal Forecast book. And that's Bob on the left in the checkered shirt. Now, his son is sitting across from him, 22-year-old Peter Brown, and Peter was the captain of the Sea Fever. So you might say, oh, that's pretty young to be a captain, but remember, he's the son of a legend, Bob Brown, one of the most successful commercial fishermen of all time. So Peter was quite experienced, even though he was young. Aside, a little sub-story within Fatal Forecast is how different these two men are. Father and son, they're as different as night and day. Bob Brown's nickname was Bob Suicide Brown.
There are two on
Because
the
he had
side.
no fear of the weather and no fear
This is
of
the one on the
ocean
storm, right?
and no fear for his crew. And Peter was the opposite. So they would butt heads because they had different views on how to run their commercial fishing operations. And that is the real Andrea Gale about a month before it disappeared in the perfect storm. But the Fatal Forecast storm came first, and it was only alluded to in the book, The Perfect Storm. And I learned about it just by accident. I was doing my first book about the sea, 10 Hours Until Dawn, which is a blizzard of 1978 rescue. And I just stumbled upon a Coast Guard casualty report about the Fatal Forecast storm. And I was like, wow, what a story. And I searched everywhere to see if anybody had written it up, and nobody had. So that's, that's how you sometimes stumble into these events. Whereas a later book, I was doing a program just like this here in New Hampshire, and there was a man in the back row who waited for everybody to leave, and he said, I've got a story for you. It just happened to me a month ago. And Ron Bird, and his story turned into the book Overboard. So I never know where the stories are going to come from. And if they don't come, I don't do it. So, but this one, it has this interesting tie-in. In the crew was Peter, of course, the captain, Sarge, Brad Bowen from New Hampshire, and Gary Brown, no relation to Peter. And there's Brad. There was a funny story about Brad when he first signed up on the vessel. You have to get clear of those lines when you drop the traps overboard. And one time, it knocked him out of the boat. Another time, he got tangled in it, and he fell on top of the trap and fell out of the boat. And then the third time, it wrapped around his ankle, and as the trap's going down, it took him down with it. If he didn't have that little knife on his belt, he wouldn't have been able to free himself. And so when his crewmates haul him up on the deck, he's vomiting and coughing up, and finally he comes to his senses, and he looks at Peter, and he goes, I can quit, I'm at it. And Peter goes, you can't quit. One more time overboard, you break the boat record. And so Brad stayed. And so that's how he became one of the permanent crew members. And then Sarge, it's funny, even though it was Peter's boat, Bob, his father, did the hiring, and Bob said to Sarge, you're too small for getting. Sarge is about my size. But he was a sergeant in the Marines. He was a tough guy. And finally, Bob gave him a chance, and Sarge really proved himself. And then Gary Brown was the most experienced of the crew. He was 27-year-old, where the other folks were in their early 20s. And this is why they're going out there. The lobsters are bigger out at George's Bank. So you expend more fuel and energy to get there, but when you catch a lobster, they're big. In fact, one time they pulled up a trap, and in it was a claw, not a lobster, but just a claw. The claw measured 18 inches across. Not the arm, just the claw. So you can imagine what the lobster must have looked like. But it's tough work, you know, you're handling equipment and you're expending energy because you're balancing. These are called the high flyers. So if you drop, say, 20 traps over, you know, in a line connected by rope, one of these will bob at the end, and you can pick this up with your radar and know where that line of traps begins and ends. You know you're tired when you fall asleep sitting next to the bait. And I would say to these guys, why do you work all these crazy hours? Because it's a recipe for accidents. You get tired, you make mistakes. They said, Mike, you have time to rest going out, you have time to rest coming back, and it costs so much in fuel to get out there that when you reach the fishing grounds, you really want to maximize your time. So that is the reasoning for it, and you've probably seen Deadliest Catch. They do the same thing today. Nothing's really changed. Now, the other boat in the fatal forecast storm was also 50 feet, but this one was made out of steel. The Fairwind, both out of Massachusetts. And on this vessel, you had Captain Billy Garnos, Rob Thayer, Dave Barry, and Ernie Hazard. And people loved working for Billy, just a great captain, Vietnam vet. And he was engaged to Maria Pavlis. These folks were on this vessel were from the North Shore of Massachusetts. And Dave Barry, young, only 18, but from a long line of lobster fishermen in the family from Marblehead. And then Rob there, who was actually taking a semester off from school to raise funds to go back. You can see some of the size of the lobsters there. And then there's the captain in the front, but in the back with the black beard, that's Ernie Hazard. He was the fourth crew member. And you'll hear a lot about him. Ernie was 33 years old, and I think it was the end of his first year on the vessel. So remember, this story takes place in late November, so keep that in mind, the temperatures. Now, the title comes from the fact that the National Weather Service gets their information from different sources to make a forecasting, one of which is the weather buoys that are out there. And the weather buoy at George's Bank during this period was malfunctioning, and the data was coming back all messed up. So they make the forecast and they say this weekend calls for rain, maximum seas of 6 to 8 feet, nothing too out of the ordinary for November. What they didn't say was that the weather buoy wasn't working. So they didn't have the usual data to make the forecast. So that's why I call it a fatal forecast, because they put the forecast out and they said everything was going to be okay, and it was not. And although I don't get into it too much in the book itself, this became a huge deal, this whole weather buoy thing, and I'll explain at the very end. Kind of a groundbreaking event with a lot of ramifications. So they're out there. They've left on a Friday. That's an old fisherman's superstition, by the way. You never leave on a Friday for an extended trip. And I asked Peter, I said, did you know that? And he said, oh yeah. He said, do you think my father was going to let me stay in port just because it's Friday? So out they went. And they went on a Friday, so by Saturday morning they're on the fishing ground, Sarge is at the wheel, and he can't believe it. The weather report is saying maximum seas of 6 to 8 feet, and already they're 10 feet. And he wakes Peter up, and Peter goes, I don't know what's going on, but we better, just kind of jog in place. And what jog in place means, they're too far to run back to the coast for safety. We're over 200 miles out to sea. So they left on a Friday, they get to the middle of George's Bank, and it's November 22nd, and Sarge wakes up Peter, and again, he's on the Sea Fever. Ernie Hazard is on the Fairwind, but there's two other vessels but they're bigger boats. But they do play a role in the story. They're much bigger. The Sea Star was the name of Bob Brown's boat, so he was out there only 50 miles away from the sun. He was on a vessel almost twice as big. And this is what Sarge was looking at. These big, steep waves coming at them, and they're trying to keep their bow into the seas. And they'd been in weather like this before, but what happens is from 6 a.m. when Sarge woke up Peter to noon, the waves increased by 10 feet per hour. So that means they're at 60 feet by noon, bigger than the boats. And yet the vessels were handling the waves pretty well. You know, they're just riding up and over, but they're getting steep. You know, when you see these streaks of white, that's not a good sign. They're steep, they're going to collapse. And so they're trying to keep their bow into the sea, similar to this photograph. And the first sign of trouble actually is inshore, just off Rhode Island. This vessel here, called the Determined, they put out a mayday that they're taking on water, and the seas are getting big even inshore, because that boat's 60 feet. You can see the seas. So the Coast Guard comes, they deliver a pump, the captain says everything's fine, and the Coast Guard leaves. 20 minutes later, the captain's going, "Mayday, mayday, we're getting off." And they had put on their survival suits because the boat was going down. And thank God the Coast Guard hadn't gone too far and could come back. So that's kind of in the beginning of the book. You have this first little, you know, kind of a glimpse of what's going to come. But for the guys way out at George's Bank, where the storm is much worse, disaster hits about noon. And the storm is exploding. And they call this what's the word? A bombogenesis is the meteorological term, because it blows up like a bomb so fast. And they're looking at one mountainous wave. This is not it, but this is representative. This was taken early during the storm. The survivors say that the wave that they saw coming at them looked between 90 to 100 feet. I just can't believe it. And all they can do is just try and get over this thing. So on the Sea Beaver, what happens is the wave breaks right on the bow. And see the front windshield here, Peter was standing here, that windshield blows in. And now you want to keep your bow into the seas, but you can't because you have no windshield and water's pouring in. So Peter's idea is to get outside in a lull, in a trough, and hammer some plywood in that broken window. So he gives the wheel to Gary Brown. He says, just kind of hold it in place. And just as Peter's about to exit, Gary shouts, "I can't hold it," because this other giant wave hits the vessel. And it hits it with such force that Gary goes right through the wooden wall of the pilot house and into the ocean. Almost like a cutout, you know, would go through the plywood wall. And so 2 of the windshields are gone. Now a side of the pilot house is gone where Gary's crashed through, and the men are trying to find Gary, and they see him, and Sarge throws a line to him. The line actually hits Gary on the shoulder, but he makes no move to hold on to it. I think he was either stunned or maybe his back was broken by the impact. But he doesn't hold on to the line, so they try one more time before another wave crashes the boat and sweeps Gary away, and they lose him. And now they're putting out maydays because the boat is flooding. And they're just hanging on for dear life and trying to get in their survival suits. Because they came off the wave, similar to this photo, you know, you would just come off it sideways, and when it hit the trough with such impact, Gary went right through the wall. Now on the Fairwind, the situation was a little different. The same wave hits them because they described it the same size. They tried to get up and over it, and what happened was the wave broke right on the vessel and spun it around So it's coming down off this giant wave bow first. And when the bow hits the trough, the bow buries in the trough, and the wave picks up the stern and pitches it over the bow. And they call that pitch poling, and it's the worst thing that can happen to you on a vessel. And so you see the makeup of this boat. Picture the whole thing is upside down. And, you know, I asked the Coast Guard, send me a picture of a really big wave hitting a boat. And they said, maybe this is what it was like. This is 90 feet, but it's a big wave. And it spun it down. Ernie Hazard is upside down in the vessel, finds a pocket of air, then sees some light below him, because to get out of the boat, you gotta swim down first. Figures it's a blown out window, goes for it, and hits his head on the glass. The window was still in place. So now he's gotta go back to get the air pocket, and the air pocket's gone. He's got no choice to go down into the darkness and try to find it. And he's feeling around, he finds a little opening, shoots through, gets to the surface. The problem is there's so much foam and crashing seas, he can't get his head high enough to get air because he's breathing in foam. And his first stroke of luck happens, a bucket comes by from the boat, tips it over, trapping air in it, and then hugs it, you know, kind of like this, to get his head a little higher. And he's got this big decision to make because the boat is a big target, so it's drifting faster than he can kick with the bucket. So he's like, do I stay with the bucket that's keeping me above the foam, or try to make it to the boat? And he decides his best hope is with the vessel. And it's agony, but he lets go of the bucket and then body surfs down the waves to get to the boat. Now, all he's got on is a pair of jeans. The waves have ripped off his sweatshirt, and he's untied his boots, so he's just in a pair of jeans. And when he gets to the vessel, he tries to climb on the overturned hull, but it's too slippery, so he goes around the other side. And so take a good look. So this is what Ernie looked like at the time. He was a strong guy, about 6'1". The extra strength was definitely a factor. But as you can see, he's not particularly big or heavy, and being big and heavy actually helps with hypothermia. You know, he was 6'1" and strong, but he didn't have that layer of fat that could have really helped him. And remember I said he couldn't get air because of all the foam, so it's like this, and he's just struggling to swim around the boat and try to get up on the other side of it. And that's when he finds the life raft. So the life rafts, and they work this way today, they're in these canisters, and they're meant to auto-inflate. They're either the water activated or they're tied to the vessel when the canister floats free. It tugs on the line and the life raft pops out. So he finds the life raft, it's still tied to the vessel, and he figures, you know, Captain Billy will be inside and the other guys. He crawls in it and it's empty. And he doesn't know what to do, but he thinks his buddies are going to get out, so he just leaves the life raft tied to the vessel. So picture, you know, he's getting pounded by waves, but he's just hanging on, peeking out the doorway as best he can to see if his buddies come out. And keeps peeking and peeking, and then finally he sees the boat. This is about 25 minutes later. He sees the boat right before his eyes start to sink. And he's like, oh no, I'm tied to it. So he's doing everything he can to try and untie those knots because it'll take him in the raft down. I'm going to go back to the sea fever, and I'm going to go through to the end of what happened then I'll bring you back to Ernie. In the book, they're happening simultaneously, so one chapter is on this vessel, one's on the other, and I alternate. You follow how these 8 men are faring in this storm. But Peter has put out a mayday. They're in the survival suits. He's tried going into the waves, can't do that because he's got 2 windshields missing. They tried going with the seas. That was a mistake. That's what put Gary right out of the boat. And now they're just sitting in there with their feet up against the engine block, hanging on for dear life so they don't fall out as the vessel comes off the waves sideways. So we come off these 60-foot waves, hit the trough, get buried, and yet this wooden boat would come back again. And the boat that heard their mayday was the Broadbill. It was a bigger vessel by Grant Moore, captained by Grant. And on the radio, Grant says, I'm coming, and it took him about 3 hours, but he did make it. And then when he's at the coordinates, he's on the radio, and he's going, Peter, I'm here, where are you? And all of a sudden, Grant looks down off this wave, and there's the sea fever, and they're coming right at it. Grant said you missed the boat by like 3 or 4 feet. You would have all been killed. And Peter's plan was, they did get survival suits on, was to jump in the water tied together and then have Grant fish them out. But Grant, when he sees just how chaotic it is, goes, don't do it, don't do it. He says, I don't think I can get you guys, the waves are too big. And Peter says, well, we gotta try. And that's when his father, who was on the bigger vessel far away, breaks in on the radio and goes to Peter, do not leave the vessel. I am telling you, Peter, do not leave the boat. You will die if you leave the boat. And Brad said, when I heard Bob say that, that gave me pause about jumping overboard in a survival suit. Because Bob had been doing this for so long. So they don't want to, but they decide they better listen to Bob. And Grant has a sigh of relief because he didn't think he could fish around the water. It's just too much. So they hang in the vessel with Grant kind of circling in a big loop. Waves are now down to about 50 feet and it's nighttime. And in the night, a Coast Guard helicopter came, and even though the event happened some years ago, I did find the pilot. And I said, so, you know, how did you do this? And he said, I told Peter, because we had radio communications with him, and I said, I don't think I can get you guys off. The vessel is just too, you know, too bumpy. Too many lumps and bumps and big waves. And the Coast Guard helicopter is being buffeted about. And he said to Peter over the radio, suggest you stay with the boat because I have no guarantee that I can get you guys. And again, Peter wants to leave the boat, but this pilot's telling him he's not sure he can do it. And the pilot instead says, I'm going to drop a pump. And I was doing this talk once, and Sarge was in the audience. And I said, so what they do is they drop the pump in the ocean, and a line from the pump, they try to let the line go over the back of the boat. So that Sarge then ran out to the deck, you know, hauled the pump in. And Sarge goes, not exactly. And I said, tell us. And Sarge goes, you couldn't run or stand. He said, I crawled on my belly. He said, the waves were 50 feet. It was crashing on the deck. And, you know, my crewmates are trying to hang on to me by the ankles, and I got the rope. We pulled the pump in, and together with a manual pump that they've been working nonstop, they were able to get more of the water out of the boat and thought maybe we can make it till morning. And they did make it to morning, and this shot was taken in the morning. You can barely see the sea beaver. It's so low in the water that just the white superstructure is showing. But by this time, the seas have gone down, and Bob Brown has made it to 50 miles or less, I think it was. And he decides that the boat can actually be saved. So rather than trying to transfer the crew, which would be dangerous, they tie lines to his bigger vessel, and they begin towing it all the way back to Cape Cod. And believe it or not, they make it. The 3 remaining survivors are on the vessel, and Bob tows them back. And it's good. There's a lot more to the story that I skip over, such as what happens when they get back. Remember, you have Bob Suicide Brown, who's very different than his son Peter. Peter's just gone through a terrible ordeal watching his best friend get killed on the boat. It's like combat. And you can see where this is the section of wall where Gary went through right here, blew out that whole panel. So we get back to Ernie. So that's what happened to the sea views. So 3 out of the 4 make it over a 24-hour period. Whereas Ernie, when he finally untied himself, his raft from the vessel, the waves just they just took the life raft. That's the end of the boat. He saw the boat sink. And the waves are so big, they've torn part of the ballast bags that hang underneath it to give it stability. And the raft is actually starting to tumble down the waves, and he's hanging on for dear life. And he's even tossed out of the raft, which is the worst thing, because you're not going to survive long in late November. And somehow manages to swim back into it. So he's got a lot of big challenges. The worst is hypothermia. But also because his boat pitch pulled so suddenly, they never got off and made it. So nobody even knows that the boat is sank. And then night is coming on, and Ernie's been thrown out of the raft 3 times already. So you can imagine, remember, he's just in jeans, water temperature is probably, maybe 53 degrees. Air temperature is probably 60 in the daytime, but probably to the low 40s at night. And he's got a lot of decisions. The first one was the right one, let go of the bucket. I do a talk for business groups, and I actually use what I learned from Ernie about decision-making under pressure, about the bucket. He knew his long-term chance of survival was with the boat, but the bucket was so comforting, and he had to let it go. When I give that talk for businesses, I say, I have my own bucket. It was a corporate job. I was afraid to let it go to run it. But I figured step by step over the years, I was getting closer and closer, and it's agonizing to let go of that comfort. But finally, when I let go of the bucket, good things started to happen. So